Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. By the time most of us reach midlife, we've certainly suffered a loss one way or the other. Perhaps a pet, loved one, friend, family. Perhaps we've even moved from a town that we've grown up in. Whatever the case is, we have to find ways that we can deal and cope with that particular loss. Otherwise, we might find ourselves buried in layers, just like an onion, without realizing what we're doing. Each and every day we may take steps forward without being aware of the fact that without having to deal and heal that particular loss, that we may go about our day, our week, and our year suffering over and over and over again without even being aware of it. The question is how to deal with loss, what we can do, what particular tools will help us not only in the grieving process, but also for us to be able to assimilate that within to our character so we can move forward into the day. Today we'd like to present a particular perspective that might be able to help us. Joining us here on the program today is someone who's going to be teaching us what is known as a Zen perspective of healing with loss. And our guest today joining us here on the program is the chaplain and education director in San Francisco of the Zen Hospice Center, our guest, Jennifer Block. And Jennifer, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Now, let's talk about what Zen is and the Zen perspective when it comes to dealing with loss and healing.
Oh, well, that's a big question. Let me see if I can break it down a little bit.
We believe in big questions to get to the point.
Right. No warm-up there. Well, the Zen perspective is, first and foremost, turning towards the loss rather than away from it. Our natural instincts, particularly our survival instinct, has us moving away from what's difficult, away from what's painful. The flight instinct, if you will, or to attack something and really dislike it, the fight instinct, if you will. A Zen perspective is one of turning towards something and saying, there it is. Oh, it's really here. Oh, let me sit with this, be with this, and get to know it. And then what happens for people, and that's not to say that that's easy, but when people do that, what they find is it's not as bad as they thought it was. And paradoxically, to be with something is a way to actually bring comfort and make it less difficult and easier to live with. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense because a lot of us, even in our own minds, it could be, for instance, that we have a troubling time, or at least we believe we will, about a particular thing. It doesn't really matter what it is. That we always think that it's going to be more than what it actually turns out to be, as you just said.
Right, and then we create for ourselves what we call in Buddhism unnecessary suffering. Unnecessary suffering. We say life is pain, but suffering is optional. So that is to say that, yes, it's very painful to lose somebody or to lose a job or to lose our waistlines. But the suffering that we have with that really comes from our not wanting it to be that way. And if we can let it be there, it's not quite as difficult.
Well, give us, our listening audience, an idea and practice of what you're talking about as it relates to perhaps a story you can share with us.
Sure. I lead an 8-week grief group for people who've lost somebody to death, and people come in and to just walk in a room and sit in a grief group and say, okay, I'm here, I've had a loss, I'm going to explore this in the company of other people and a skillful facilitator is a way to turn towards the loss. So first of all, just to do something related to grief is a way to do that. Secondly, a member of our group this week, as she sat down, told us about not only is she grieving her father, but a neighbor died this week, and a relative was just diagnosed with cancer. So she had a lot going on and was very tearful. But it seemed to me like she was choking back the tears and taking tissues and almost pushing them into her eyes, like to say, maybe if I push the tears back in, I won't hurt so much. I asked her what was going on in her body, and she said that her chest was really tight, as if she had been kicked in the chest by a horse. That I wish it would go away. So actually what I invited her to do was to leave her attention on that place in her body and see if she could just get to know its shape and texture, imagine the color with it, and sit with it, really, for the duration of the group. She said, it feels like there's hands around my throat. I said, okay, and just pay attention to how tightly they're gripping. A little while later, I checked in with her, and I said, what's happening? And she said, it's softer. The hands are gone. I can breathe now past like 2 inches down into my chest. So this is a very visceral, physical example of what happens when we be with something rather than push it away. I think the resistance actually is what can choke us, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just an example on a physical level. An example of an emotional level is when I encourage people to tell the story of their loss and to not talk about how life is getting better and they're getting through it. I ask them, how bad is it? How horrible was it to lose your loved one? What is the story? And they tell the story, and it's very difficult. But on the other side, they say, wow, I've never told the story in its complete, in its completeness, and had people listen so clearly and not try to fix me and let me just feel badly while I told the story. Gee, what a relief. I feel a little bit better, a little more comfortable. So those are two examples.
It's really fascinating. You bring up something we've actually covered grief on our program in many different ways, and of course to share opportunities and tools for people to cope with or integrate the grief into who they are. And one of the biggest things that happens that you just brought up is how our society tends to fix people who are grieving. They may say things, and it's funny because it's in our culture, it's in our movies, it's in everything. The example that I mean by that is, for instance, let's say someone's husband dies. And so friends and loving family will come around and say, that's okay, they went off to a better place. Or there are things just like that, as though they're actually making the situation better, but in fact they're not really doing anything, if anything, making it worse.
Not so much. For most people, that's it. And I think it's because people don't know what to say and they're afraid of their own losses. Because every time somebody I know loses somebody, the first thing I do is think either about, what if I lost my partner like she lost her partner? Or, oh yeah, I did lose my mother like she did. Like our own grief gets activated. So I actually think that's what makes people not so skillful and say things that they've seen done but may not be so feel. They're kind of pushing away in some ways their own relationship to grief. My other favorite is when people say, well, you just got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Yeah, pick up as though life just moves on. Exactly.
Yeah. No, I feel like, take your boots off, roll down on the ground, lie in the mud, and I'll
walk across the rocks with your tenderfoot, boy. You'll really feel yourself.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about the types of Buddhist practices that you give to the group that can be done to express and support someone's grief. You talked about a couple of them. What are some of the other ones that you like to use?
Well, Buddhism is a fairly large philosophy and tradition, and from Southeast Asia, the Buddhism that's come to the West that's most popular is mindfulness practice or meditation. So we use mindfulness practice, which is to sit silently and still and breathe naturally and to watch what arises. And when something arises, such as sensation or a thought or a feeling, to go towards it rather than away from it. So like the woman I talked about with her chokehold, in her alertness, she was paying attention to that. But actually in meditation, we train on how to pay attention to things. And so if I have pain in my knee, my first thought is I wish that pain wasn't there. But the second thought with a lot of practice and reminding is, oh, I think I'll keep an eye on that pain and see what it's like. So mindfulness training is a great tool that we use with people. And some people really like that. Another tool that we use is to create an altar. In our offices, when people come, or we encourage people in their homes to actually give a visual expression to their loss. A picture, a candle, We have an altar covered with names of people who've died. And really, for us, this is not hiding death and not hiding loss, but bringing it into the center of our lives. Mm-hmm. So this is another way of turning towards rather than away from our losses and our grief. So those are a few things off the top of my head. I know there's more. Give me a moment. Oh, then the other thing we do is we look at the phenomena of loss in general. So I have people create a grief timeline, which is to write a line that's horizontal on a paper, put on the left the year they were born, and put on the right end of the line a question mark, because we don't know the year of our death. So put little marks and write out different losses and changes that have happened in their lives, such as leaving home, the end of their first romantic relationship, an end of a relationship, leaving college, losing a job, losing a loved one to death. And people begin to see that there's actually a pattern of loss in their lives. And in that pattern is also their own difficult times and then getting through it or learning to live with it. And so they can see, I have found my way in the past, and so I will find my way again. So this is a matter really of a perspective on one's loss. And then we look forward from the current year and imagine what losses will we have. So then I would make a mark on, well, someday I will lose my parents, my siblings will die, I will have to give up my home, I will retire, Parkinson's runs in my family, I may have Parkinson's. So then we also look forward and imagine what our losses will be. One of the primary teachings of Buddhism is that we struggle and we suffer because we forget that life is constant change and that nothing is permanent or fixed or solid. So when we look at our lives and see how much has changed and look forward into our lives, it helps us maintain that perspective that, oh yes, this is the nature of life. Everything arises and everything passes away. The Buddha taught, how to kind of remember that day to day so that you suffer a little bit less when things change. So that timeline is very powerful for people. They have some sense of appreciation of their own journey and then also begin to look ahead, sometimes with some anxiety, but also sometimes with I think I better get ready. This is going to happen no matter what. That's something else that we do with people that's very powerful for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting because, as you said, a lot of times we try to run away or bury a loss that we've suffered. It could be a very small, even up to a very large loss. And then, as you were saying earlier, you encourage them to take a look at the pattern of loss. Now, what do you exactly mean by that? Is it true that people actually begin to notice patterns? Is that a way they can break away from a pattern of loss, or what exactly is that?
It's a great question. Well, we are conditioned very early on how to respond to loss. Some people say, my grandmother died and I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. I never got to say goodbye to her. Other people say, the house was full of people. I remember looking at my grandmother's dead body, and I remember my pet dying. So we have very early imprinting or conditioning about loss. Everybody in my family talked about it. Nobody talked about it. So the first thing is to look at what's my early conditioning. And then, in the past, it seems that talking about it helped me, and I broke from the family tradition of not talking about it. So I think I'll keep talking about it. That's one example. Also, grief expresses itself not just in our emotions, but in our bodies, in our mental capacities, in the way that we relate to people, the way that we make meaning of the world and relate to a greater power or God, if you will, or ultimate truth. So people also can look to see how their own beliefs and expressions of grief have expressed themselves. I just met with somebody a few days ago who said, I lost my daughter in April. She was mentally ill and suffered greatly. In some ways, I'm relieved. My wife is furious at me because I'm not sad. So we talked more, and I asked him about different aspects of his life, and we came to realize that he was having difficulty reading. He was going for long walks, and he never used to go for long walks. He was no longer at the gym on the cardio machine, and that his sleep patterns had changed. So these were expressions of his grief for him to get to understand and appreciate rather than think that only his grief should be done through sadness, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, again, these are the patterns, these are the things that we do, and a lot of what is beneficial for people is to understand that grief expresses itself in many ways. Grief is a journey, and it's not something that we get over so much as integrate into our lives and ultimately are changed by, in a Buddhist point of view, wholehearted way. We say that when people deal with difficult things and integrate loss, we actually become more wise and more compassionate, and our hearts grow to hold these wisdom and compassion.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's funny because you bring up to me something that I think is very important for our listening audience, and as we were talking about grief patterns, ways of grieving, and that in this particular scenario you were saying that this guy felt relief in the passing of someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because there's a whole different kind of a loss, it seems, altogether right there, that you didn't grieve the way someone thinks you should have. And so that causes, I think, a loss in and of itself, and that's the loss of grieving the way you would naturally.
Right. And sometimes for the partner, they feel abandoned. They want their partner to grieve the way that they are grieving. Let's both be sad together. Let's both be angry together. Let's both, be remorseful as we give our daughter's belongings away. So it can be very difficult to keep an intimate relationship together when people are having very different experiences of the grief expression. Exactly. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was so helpful. I'm sure you've talked about her on other shows. Is one of the kind of founders of the current grief movement and helping people understand grief. Have you talked about her on your show?
Well, she's been on our program inadvertently, and it's about the stages of loss. And what's been interesting about that is that the guests that we've had on our program bring up, yes, these stages do exist, but that you don't go from A to Z, so to speak. That you kind of move in and out of each of those stages at different periods of time and for any length of time.
Yes, I think that's true. And stage may even be the wrong word. They're different phenomena, I think. I think of it more of a helix. These things just interconnect and change and turn. She, late in her life, actually, there was a documentary about her, interviewing her when she was sick and bedbound and pretty isolated in her home in the Southwest. And at one point she looked at the camera and she said, I've accompanied hundreds, if not thousands, of people in grief and in death. She said, this is a lot harder than I thought it was. Somebody who had so much skill and so much practice and so much opportunity to be with death and dying. Still, in the end, we're all alone, facing ourselves and the great loss of our lives. And no matter how much I think we understand, it's still at some level going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I do agree, though, that these are not stages. And I'd like to think that she created them to help people understand what was happening, because a lot of people feel out of control with grief. It's so powerful. It takes over our bodies and our appetites and our ability to focus and how we relate to people, and we feel out of control. So to have ideas and somebody saying, this is real, this is what this is a way, I think, to be less afraid of our grief and to trust it more, even while it's difficult. So I really appreciate her teachings for that very reason, is that she helped people understand, normalize, and begin to talk about grief in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the key there, is that we don't get the opportunity, as you say, a lot of times to express how we, our grief, to really feel and be in that grief, and to just really allow it to run its course. As you've been running the Zen Hospice Center, have you seen a length of time that seems common in a natural course of grieving?
Not really. I've heard people say that the first year was unique, wild, difficult. Some people don't hardly remember the first year after a significant loss. They say, I know I was living my life and talking to everybody, but she said, people will say, I don't remember much, to tell you the truth. And I know we went to Mexico, but I couldn't tell you, what town it was in Mexico. They literally, so there's some ways in which I just prepare people to say, this first year, as difficult as it is, will be an exceptional year in your life, no matter what. It will always be the year that your loved one died, no matter what. So don't try to make it like every other year. Just let it be a year. And there was a great book written, The Year of Magical Thinking, where Joan Didion wrote a lovely book, and she called it The Year of Magical Thinking. And just that title in itself can tell you that there's at least a year. She wrote about how she didn't give away her husband's shoes for a year because he might need them. For a year, at some level, they're coming back. So I think the first year is significant. And then after that, who knows? I think grief is a mystery. It's kind of like death. We know a little bit, and then we just live through it and figure it out as we go along. I don't like to give people a timeline because they begin to judge themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, I've got a year. Oh, my year's up. Uh-oh. That's not very helpful.
Well, that's like with the Mary Kubler-Ross stages. They think, okay, I've already experienced, for instance, denial,
right.
And then they move on to the next one. And the fact is that you move in and out of each of those stages on a consistent basis, and that it gets to a point that you really, as you said earlier in the program, you begin to integrate the loss into who you are.
Exactly.
And I think that really changes a person's life, where grieving can actually become a gift. A loss can become a gift in and of itself. In your experience, have you seen that to be true?
Yes, I think people, their hearts are broke open. People who grieve, their hearts are broken. They're just broken. But then I think when our hearts heal, it's kind of like a clay jar. You can glue it back together, but it's never quite the same, and it's slightly larger, with the glue between the cracks. So I actually do think that if we're skillful in being with our grief, if we don't shut it down, if we don't stay in anger and kind of close our hearts, that we become better people, and actually then able to go to somebody who's had a loss and not say they're in a better place. If I've grieved and my heart has mended and it's slightly larger, I may be the person who goes to you when you've lost your loved one and say, wow, you're probably having a horrible day and there's nothing I can say, but I just know that I'm keeping you in my heart and I've been there.
Mm-hmm.
What a wonderful thing to say to somebody. Kind of like, welcome to the tribe of grieving people, rather than, don't grieve, don't remind me of my grief, and take care of yourself. So I think that we become better companions for others. That may be the hidden jewel within the muck of our loss in the process.
I'm reminded, Jennifer, of many years ago in my early adult years, as I had lost, or should I say, I had a girlfriend who decided, this relationship isn't going to work. It was a very brief relationship, but still, it caused a broken heart. And so I tended to try to reach out to friends, especially a best friend, and this is really, just getting to me. And it seemed eventually that each and every time we would meet up, it's about her again, isn't it? And he'd kind of laugh. And it was funny, because what was funny about that was how the tables had turned.
Right.
And he had to go through that.
Yes.
And I said, don't you find this interesting now that you want me to sit and listen to your grief, but you used to laugh mine off? How does it feel now?
Right.
It's like I kind of felt a bit of vengeance there,
Sure.
But the thing, and this was a good, couple of years later, that because of his own particular loss, that old stuff was coming back up, as though I was still a little like I wanted to hit him upside the head, like you deserve to hurt, kind of a thing. But it's interesting how when a person can shut you off like that you could take on a whole new pattern of action. That I don't know. As you said, it's interesting.
And then I think we're a grief-denying society as much as we're a death-denying society.
Oh, absolutely.
We don't wear black anymore when somebody dies. We don't rip our clothes. We're far away from our families of origin. I mean, if I lived in the town I was born and raised in, and everybody knew me at my church, and I was a local school teacher, and I wore black, I would be kind of held and remembered, People used to be kind of held in their community and remembered. In the Jewish tradition, when you're grieving for a year, you sit in a different part of the temple and you come in a different door so that people remember and attend to you in your grief process. And we're lost now. We don't know who's grieving or what's going on for them. Sometimes when I'm at the airport I don't know if you've noticed this, but people behave very badly at the airport. I don't know what's going on with people. They're rude. Airports seem to bring out the worst in people.
And restaurants.
And restaurants. So, when I look out over the airplane or over the waiting area or the long lines, sometimes I think to myself, I wonder how many people here are going onto this plane to visit a sick or dying relative. How many of these people are grieving? How many people just lost their jobs? And it helps me cut them a little slack for behaving so badly. Like when I look at a crowd now, I just think, how many people are sick and dying here or caring for somebody or grieving? If this is a human condition and there's 100 people in front of me, there's got to be at least 20 or 30 that are experiencing this acutely. And I like to remember that as a way to just keep turning towards the truth. Again, what the Buddhist perspective is, that everything arises and everything passes away, and the more we get used to that, the more we'll be able to be a good friend when somebody else has their heart broken.
And certainly one of the greatest gifts that I believe grieving can bring for anyone who, if you will, say, heals through the grieving process or glues back together the broken heart as it opens, is that compassion enters our lives. And it gives you a new way of seeing the world. And just as you said, when you go to airports, for instance, you realize some of these people may be going on because of a passing of a loved one, and so you seek to understand, and then you're understood. It's quite interesting.
Or who's sick and dying, So many of us are sick, and again, nobody knows it, because we're functioning. We're at the grocery store standing in line. Sometimes I wonder, just statistically speaking, there have to be a lot of sick people here right now who are feeling nauseous or have chronic pain or depression or an anxiety disorder, and being in the airport just puts them over the edge, Although that's not to say I like it when I get shoved out of the way when I'm in security. My first reaction is, give me a break, buddy. I'm just taking off my shoes. How important is it?
Exactly. Now let's talk about the Zen Hospice project and how that came to be created.
Sure. So in San Francisco, there is the San Francisco Zen Center, which is the oldest Buddhist monastery in the United States. It was started by a man named Suzuki Roshi, who was sent to San Francisco by his bishop in Japan to care for the Japanese in San Francisco. But when he got here in the 50s, the Japanese had just been interred during the Second World War, so they weren't so hip on Zen practice. And then he met a bunch of hippies in San Francisco who wanted to practice Zen. So they started a monastery here. And after about 20 years, as people had been doing intensive meditation and chanting and temple practice, living the monastic lifestyle in the middle of the city, they realized that just down the street there were people who were homeless and sick. And somebody else in their community became sick and was dying. So they started little by little taking care of people who were sick and dying. And then the AIDS epidemic hit San Francisco, and the Zen Center was literally in the epicenter of the epidemic, and began, again, taking people in and taking care of them. And then what we saw was everything that we had practiced or encountered on the meditation cushion in long retreats was also there at the bedside. So our own aversions, our own attachments, our own lessons, our own family histories, so that there was some natural connection between meditation practice and being at the bedside. And then eventually, 5-10 years went by, Zen Hospice Project became a separate nonprofit organization. So we're kind of a offspring, if you will, of the largest Buddhist monastery in the country. And we brought in volunteers. We learned that actually professional help is not so helpful. People just need good, kind companions to help them bathe and eat, to cook for them. So one of the hallmarks of our care during the epidemic and since then, and it's been 20-plus years since we began, is everyone taking care of everyone, and an emphasis on not professional care, but just our own innate capacity to care for one another. At Zen Hospice, we say we're born to care for people who are sick and dying and grieving, but with the advent of medical technology, we've begun to forget.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to remind people this is in your bones. You know how to do this. This is not rocket science. People are afraid. They don't know how to care because it's difficult, but we help them do it.
You bring up something interesting that I'm reminded of a documentary that I'd seen a couple of years ago about 9/11. And it was 9/11, a 24-hour perspective. I don't remember the actual title of it. But what had happened is they had something like, let's say, a dozen or so people in different areas around Ground Zero filming what was going on for the course of it was actually a week, I'm sorry, and how people were coping with what had just happened. And just as you were saying, you found this tremendous sense of well-being of the fact that we do naturally know how to care for other people when it comes to a loss. And, imagine something like 9/11. You'd seen people just numb, and how others were gathering around, providing comfort to the point where there were these large, heated group discussions, about how to, what do we do, what's going on here? It was really amazing to see what was unfolding.
Exactly, and that's the power of the human heart in my mind, is that as much as we're afraid, that's 49% sometimes of who we are, but 51% of us is kind and good and wanting to just be connected to other people. So I count on that 1%, if not more, to tip us in the right direction.
Now, is there a website people can go and find out more
Sure.
about the Zen Hospice Center and
so
how to deal with loss?
zenhospice.org, and we're in San Francisco, and we have a program where volunteers join us for a year to care for people who are sick and dying. And then we also have a program of bereavement services for the public, so anybody that's looking for a grief group or some one-to-one support. We're doing a workshop between Thanksgiving and Christmas, so that people have a place to be when they're not feeling so cheery about the holidays. So zenhospice.org.
Now, I know that
let me just mention, we also have some recorded teachings that we sell for people, because long distance, anywhere, people need to kind of be reminded of what I'm talking about. So we also have some audio recordings that people love.
What I was going to ask, too, Jennifer, is because of Buddhism, they have a belief in reincarnation. How does that help with the grief process when you are, especially in a center that's hospice care? These are people that are, going to be dying and they need, care and attention.
Right.
Let's talk about that real quickly.
Sure. So the people we care for are not necessarily Buddhists. They just want kind people, good food, a warm, clean bed. Sometimes they are Buddhist practitioners, and Buddhist practitioners, if they believe in reincarnation, there's a journey between the moment of death and the beginning of the next life. So when somebody dies, we actually are careful to not move the body. The Buddhist tradition is to not disturb a body for up to 3 days, so that person's spirit or soul, if you will, although soul is not a very Buddhist word, can make that journey successfully. And people will sit around the person who has died and meditate, tell stories, chant. We bathe them, surround them with flowers, remove the medical equipment, and really try to hold and embody and express the belief that death is not just a medical event, that death is a huge spiritual or mysterious process for people. And reincarnation for some Buddhist practitioners is very, very important. And their lives have been all about accruing enough good effort, if you will, or merit, so that in the next lifetime they have higher or better rebirth, if you will. When people are grieving, this is not so helpful. I don't, it's kind of like saying they're in a better place. If I was to say to somebody, well, if you're Buddhist and your loved one has been reincarnated and they're fine, I don't really go there when people are acutely grieving. It's just it's not very helpful. Reincarnation is a very complex part of Buddhism, and I can just, probably hear your Buddhist scholar listeners, if there are any, just probably screaming at the radios, there's more to it than that, lady. Let me just say right now, I'm not an academic Buddhist.
Yeah, well, just remember, we're in a better place than they are right now.
Is the radio a better place?
You just never know. And just as long as we don't lose the listeners, and we're allowed to follow the natural course of grieving. It's always a fascinating subject to talk about. And people, when they think of loss, the first thing a lot of them will think of when you talk about that we're a loss denying society is they think of death. And I mean, loss, it could go to losing a pet, for instance. And it's amazing that if the natural grieving process doesn't allow itself to run its course for a person to feel and express that, as you say, it causes a pattern after a while of how a person lives.
Yes. And for something like pet loss, in the profession we call this disenfranchised grief. So in some ways, to lose a family member, a loved one, is acknowledged more than losing a pet. Some people feel like nobody will really acknowledge that my grief is very large and very deep and very powerful for me because it was my pet. Mm-hmm. They were really understanding, or more understanding, when it was my mother, but not with my pet. So I really try to pay attention to all types of losses for people. And people will often ask, what's the worst type of loss? Is it losing a partner or a parent or a child? And I think a skillful response to that is every loss is the worst loss for that person at that time.
Right.
So for them there in that moment, it is the worst loss imaginable.
I think what's interesting about loss is the fact that when we lose something, it pulls us out of a comfort zone and a pattern of being comfortable.
Yes, and that comfort zone is some level, as we would say in Buddhism, of delusion. That we're deluded that we have a lot of time and that everything is fine all the time. And really Buddhist practice is about taking a closer look at the fact that things are unstable and tenderizing our lives and our hearts to that fact so that we can actually appreciate life all the more and not be comfortable in a sleepy comfortable, but comfortable more in the coming and going of life and getting used to that reality.
Very much agreed. As they say, beginning to learn to integrate what is known as impermanence.
Exactly.
Well, Jennifer Block, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program to share a Zen perspective of what it is to heal loss. And I don't know that we ever really truly heal. A loss never goes away. You just can't forget it. But what you begin to do is integrate that into who you are. And I think that's what makes each and every one of us unique when we're here on the planet.
I think that's true. And I want to acknowledge that as we've been talking, some of the listeners are really grieving. And I just want to wish them well. In our tradition, we say that when people come together to talk about grief or death, we're actually generating good karma. This is beneficial to talk about what's difficult. So I'd like to extend this good karma out to your listeners who are having a hard time today with their losses.
I think the hardest loss that they're going to suffer in the next minute is the fact the show will be over with.
Oh, that's terrible. I hope you have some people on hand that they can call.
I do too.
Emergency grief support.
Well, Jennifer Block, thank you again for joining us, and please give your website out again.
ZenHospice.org.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for joining us here on
pleasure.
Beyond 50. You bet.
All my best to you.
So there it is, a Zen perspective on loss. Be in the loss, experience it, and be allowed to have that become part of who you are. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. That's a loss that you can't do without. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, live your day past halfway.